Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from Rouse IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 12th of June 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on your screen, and let us now begin the discussion.
China-Sri Lanka Friendship Hospital opened. This new hospital, which was built with a Chinese grant of around $60 million, specializes in kidney ailments. And so yesterday, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa of Sri Lanka inaugurated the China-Sri Lanka Friendship Hospital in some place built with Chinese grants. Now this is a very small instance, and you might be wondering why we have taken this particular news. Now this could be a small news, but it overall fits the narrative of increasing Chinese influence in India's neighborhood. Under GS Paper 2, under International Relation, India and its neighborhood relations are very important part of the syllabus. And an intrinsic feature of India's relationship with its neighbors is how China's relationship with its neighbor is evolving. And just to demonstrate it to you, India and Nepal has always shared very warm and friendly relationship. But with increasing influence of China in Nepal and in Nepalese politics, relationship of India with that of Nepal is kind of souring in last 5 to 10 years, and that is mainly because of increasing penetration and influence of China in Nepal. And so, what are the challenges which have been posed due to the increasing influence of China in India's neighborhood, and which are creating challenges for India's foreign policy, and how India has resorted to respond to it, is what we are going to discuss now. And so whenever you have to enumerate the Chinese challenges for India, especially in India's neighborhood or in Indo-Pacific region or in South Asia, these are 7 main challenges which China's increasing assertion and aggression is creating in India's immediate neighborhood. And we'll start by Belt and Road Initiative, which is a global infrastructure development strategy adopted by Chinese government in 2013, which aims to invest in nearly 70 countries and international organizations. And without any doubt, a lot of countries included in Belt and Road initiatives are not just our neighbors, but some of them are enemies as well. For example, CPEC or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is all about funding massive infrastructural projects in Pakistan. Then you have Maritime Silk Road. Then you have Trans-Himalayan Multidimensional Connectivity Network, which is going to be an economic corridor between Nepal and China. So now you can clearly appreciate how China is increasingly ingraining itself in India's neighborhood. So that was one. The next set of challenge from China comes from string of pearls hypothesis, which was proposed by United States researchers. The term refers to the network of Chinese military and commercial facilities and relationship along its sea lines of communication, which extend from the Chinese mainland to Port of Sudan in the Horn of Africa. And this string of pearls has been discussed a lot of times in our DNS, and so that is not going to be the main topic of our discussion. But still you can see how sea lines run through several major maritime choke points such as Strait of Mandab, Strait of Malacca, Strait of Hormuz, Lombok Strait, as well as other strategic maritime centers in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives and Somalia. And the best case demonstration of this would be Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka and Gwadar Port in Pakistan. So Belt Road Initiative and string of pearls, these are the keywords. Next important keyword which you should pay attention to is debt diplomacy, or also otherwise known as checkbook diplomacy. And if you are reading newspaper very regularly, I don't need to explain this to you. You have seen what has happened to with this very specific Hambantota port. First, China lends a massive sum of amounts to a small country, let's say Sri Lanka, knowing fully well that Sri Lanka will not be able to pay it back even the interest amount. Sri Lanka uses that lent money to develop an infrastructural project. To start with, was unviable. It was uneconomical to even start with. When Hambantota port started, most of the political thinkers and economists suggested that this would be of no use. Similarly, if you look at headlines for Gwadar port, it is uneconomical, and just the Chinese defense forces are stationed there, their naval ships, their submarines, and nothing else. It is uneconomical for a country like Sri Lanka and Pakistan to develop another big port when they already have Colombo port in Sri Lanka and Karachi port in Pakistan. There is not so much of trade even to handle it. And so once this infrastructural project is developed, it is not able to garner the kind of return on investment it was first conceptualized by the Chinese that it will. Since it is not able to generate its own revenue, China wants its interest back, and in return, the country has to give the possession of the infrastructure completely to Chinese. And so you can say that it is a kind of a practice by a powerful lending country, and so this is the reason why it is called debt diplomacy or debt trap diplomacy, because in it the creditor country intentionally extends excessive credit to a debtor country, thereby inducing the debtor into a debt trap. And this is also increasingly being observed in our neighborhood. And so Belt Road Initiative number 1, String of Pearls number 2, Debt Diplomacy number 3. And now we move on to number 4, which is new defense pact being signed by China in our neighborhood. And the best case example would be with Pakistan. It has signed a very new defense pact. Then continuous Chinese aggression along India's border along the line of actual control, China is trying to challenge or perpetually keep India under stress. Be it regular Chinese incursions and standoffs in Ladakh, construction of villages inside the Indian perception of line of actual control, or be it troubling a small pro-India country sandwiched between India and China and creating a trouble like Doklam dispute in Bhutan. Now, a lot of experts have suggested that these incursions along the line of actual control and along Bhutan border is just not meant for India, but rather it is a kind of messaging to countries which are friendlier to India or pro-India. India being the largest country in the neighborhood, China wants to give a message that look, we are troubling the biggest country in your neighborhood, and so better fall in line and either join Belt and Road Initiative or clearly take pro-China line in your foreign policy. Otherwise, you have seen what we have done to other countries. Then China has tried a lot of vaccine diplomacy in our neighborhood. We have seen that our vaccine Matri failed miserably because we were hit by the second wave of COVID, and so we know how India had promised a lot of vaccine exports to various neighboring countries. And a lot more was to be committed in the coming months, but before that we were hit by the second wave and all of that vanished. And because of India's withdrawal from vaccine diplomacy, Chinese quickly filled in as they do in all the cases, and they have started supplying vaccines to not just Pakistan and Nepal but also to Afghanistan, Bangladesh and even Sri Lanka. And so now you can see that most members of SAARC excluding India are receiving Chinese vaccines despite them being of very poor quality. But this also shows the increasing penetration of Chinese in India's neighborhood. And then finally, fueling anti-India sentiment in India's neighborhood, something at which Chinese are experts. They are experts because they have invested a lot of money in these countries, they have given a lot of debt or loans to these countries, they have signed defense pacts, and because of that Chinese diplomats have quite good and friendly relation with a lot of big politicians in almost all the countries in our neighborhood. And so when you see instances like Kala Pani dispute with India, a very trivial, unimportant, minor dispute of land between India and Nepal which did not exist until 2 years ago is suddenly brought to the limelights in Nepal just to rev up anti-India sentiments there. Then whatever has happened in Maldives in last 5 to 10 years is because of increasing Chinese influence in that country. Although right now the government we have over here is quite friendly to India, but that does not denies the possibility of a future revolt and again installation of a pro-Chinese government over there. And so clearly India cannot sit idle, and it is not sitting idle. India has made its own effort to counter the increasing influence of China in India's neighborhood, and let us go through them. And so the first thing which India has laid emphasis on, infrastructure push. To counter the Chinese offer of Belt and Road Initiative, India has tried to develop a lot of massive infrastructural projects in our neighborhood. And just to give you two examples of Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, India is constructing railway lines in Sri Lanka and has constructed massive housing projects there. As far as Bangladesh is concerned, India is also constructing railways there along with investing a great deal in power projects. And so you can see that India is clearly trying to counter the Chinese presence through infrastructure push. And then comes connectivity. See, connectivity is important because if you want to have good relations, you should have good trading relations first. Because after all, these are neighbors. If they are not going to trade among themselves, this whole region is not going to progress as whole. And so for that, you need good connectivity. You already know India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway is under construction. Then we have Kaladan multimodal project. Then there is International North-South Transport Corridor or INSTC, for which we have constructed Chabahar Port, which will also give us access into Afghanistan. So these are the kinds of connectivity projects we are laying around our neighborhood or extended neighborhood. Then comes the extension of line of credit. So it is also like a debt which is extended by India to its neighbors. So line of credit is the amount of money which can be taken as a loan by these countries. An extension of that amount is known as extension of line of credit. And so India extends substantive amounts of money to Maldives, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and various other countries including Afghanistan. And now you will say that what remains the difference between India and China? After all, it looks like India is also pursuing debt trap diplomacy. But here is an important difference between how India extends its loans and China extends its loan. India never or very rarely makes its loans conditional upon its usage. And so when Maldives takes loans from India, India does not ask what are the purposes for which it is going to be utilized, unlike Chinese, which give loans specifically for end purpose, as you can see in the news today itself. And so these countries, wherever they think it fit, they use that fund. And so that is why none of the countries have complained against the extension of line of credit by India, but they have now increasingly started viewing Chinese debts as a kind of liability which they should get rid of immediately. Then in the beginning of COVID pandemic, India started very well with COVID vaccine diplomacy. It did not go as well as it was thought simply because India was struck with the second wave, we all know. And so this point should not be included in your mains answer when you walk into the examination hall in December 2021. Then India has laid emphasis on revival of BIMSTEC and active participation of the member countries into this particular group after the SAARC failed in its purpose. We needed a group which particularly caters to the needs of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and now we have a BIMSTEC on which India is laying a lot of emphasis. And then finally, to counter the increasing presence of Chinese in Indo-Pacific region, India has actively participated in quadrilateral security dialogue and other military naval exercises, for example, Malabar naval exercises. And so this has been India's approach to counter increasing Chinese influence in India's neighborhood. However, these efforts should be complemented with continuous engagement, greater connectivity, economic integration with an aim of extracting strategic leverage. Refocused vaccination campaigns are possible. And so just by looking at the heading, you can understand what would be the topic of next 1400 or so odd words discussion, and that would be about modification in India's vaccine policy. Now generally we don't take such editorials which raise one or two single points, because these one or two points are not going to become important for your mains or prelims examination. But in this particular article, the points which have been suggested are very, very important, which can be raised as single statement or as a case study when you are writing a broader answer, for example, about India's response to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as far as syllabus is concerned, it gets covered under GS paper 2 governance, where you have to understand welfare schemes for vulnerable sections of the population by center and state. And now the vaccine distribution is an important component in 2020-21 of how we choose to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and save our population and especially the vulnerable section of our society. Right now we know how vaccination is working. there is a portal known as CoWin, and all registrations and vaccination slots are being booked by this particular portal. Now, this portal has been created in order to introduce transparency and accountability in the way vaccination is being done, because you should understand that in times of pandemic, vaccine is after all the most sought after commodity. And so what CoWin has done is that it has introduced a greater transparency in the way vaccine is being distributed. To get slots, you will have to book it on CoWin, without which you won't get the slots. If you get the vaccine somehow, you will not get the certificate of vaccination, and so that is the problem. But according to the authors, this mandatory registration on CoWin is creating problems for two very vulnerable sections of our society. One is older adults, let's say people belonging to 70, 80, 90 years of age, and second is marginalized community, or people belonging to below poverty line, or belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. According to the author, there is a need to prioritize the distribution of vaccine for them, and the authors also suggest the ways to do it. Starting with why they should be prioritized. They should be prioritized according to author because first and foremost, older adults, elderlies are the most vulnerable sections of our society in terms of health. A 70-year-old female could be very rich, but she could easily become a target of COVID, because we have seen the mortality rates are quite high in 60+ people. And the reason behind that is they observe or witness very high severity of the COVID-19 disease, irrespective of the kind of strain you are infected with. Apart from that, most elderly are not very comfortable with digital technologies, and so there is a hindrance which is created in the way they are going to use the app or the website through which they are going to book the slots. If they don't book the slot, they will have to walk into the nearest vaccination center without an appointment, which puts them on a higher risk of infection because there is a very high waiting time at the vaccination centers. And so that is why the authors talk about prioritizing the elderlies first, although they agree that the slots were open to 60+, 45+ in a sequential manner. But now, since it has been opened for everyone and there is lesser availability of the vaccine, there could be a scenario where most of the middle-aged population is vaccinated but elderlies are not. According to the authors, that will be a catastrophic situation. After elderlies, why are marginalized community, even young people, are at higher risk of COVID-19 pandemic? Because they mostly work outside their homes, not like us who have the luxury of working from home. They have to venture out, and so they have high exposure to any kind of virus, not just COVID-19. Combine that with low nutrition levels or multi-generational malnutrition, because of which they just not face stunting and wasting, but also the lack of very essential nutrients like calcium, zinc, all of which is very essential to fight COVID-19 pandemic. Combine that with low level of literacy and awareness about the disease. Since they are not literate or educated, they don't have understanding of how virus transmits from one person to another. What is sanitization? How to wear mask correctly? On top of it, they also have high vaccine hesitancy. Simply because they are not educated, they are likely to believe on rumors very easily. And that is the reason because of which our rural areas are observing such low vaccination rates, because of very high vaccine hesitancy. And just like the elderly, they face digital hindrance, or they are on the other spectrum of digital divide. Either they don't have gadgets. If they have gadgets, don't have internet connection. If they have both, they are unlikely to be very comfortable with using the CoWin app or CoWin website. All of it surely means that the vaccination rates among these people is going to be very low. And all these combined with the low availability of the vaccine reinforces their idea that vaccine is not such a great thing. And so here the author suggests a case study, a model which can be emulated by other states as well, and that is of Chhattisgarh, where the vaccination plan prioritizes ration card holders specifically because they are poor and often live in multi-generation larger households, putting them at high risk of infection. So one is this model which can be emulated, and other suggestions according to the author is to carry out camps for COVID-19 vaccinations in the population where the density of marginalized section or elderly is very high. According to the author, there should be door-to-door services of vaccine delivery of COVID-19 by healthcare professionals, just like the way we do for polio and other child vaccinations. And then according to the authors, there needs to be a women-only day in a week where only women can be vaccinated across the country. We need women-only vaccine days to ensure that women know that they are being prioritized. According to the author, during the 1918 influenza pandemic, India was one of the few locations where mortality was higher in women than in men, and we don't know the reason behind this fact. And so, in the current pandemic, it is very possible that if women are not explicitly prioritized, economic pressures to protect males, who are often the breadwinners for the family, and the historically marginalized stature of women in the society will end up resulting in gender inequalities even in vaccine uptake. So this is the crux of this particular article, and the only relevance of this particular discussion is in the mains examination, where you can suggest these points as a way forward to India's vaccination policy. Myanmar violence escalating, creating rights catastrophe appears on page number 13. And so the UN rights chief has said yesterday that violence was escalating across Myanmar, warning that the country had plunged into a human rights catastrophe since February 1 coup. Myanmar, being our important neighbor, is very important from the perspective of GS paper 2 under international relation, and recently it has undergone a military coup. And so it is very important for us to understand these dynamics, and in this regard we have already had a discussion detailing about various dimensions of overall India-Myanmar relation and what is the overall significance of Myanmar in India's foreign policy. And so we will go through that discussion over here for next 10 minutes. Therefore, we are going to start the discussion by first understanding what is the overall importance of Myanmar in Indian context. Then we are going to understand the historical perspective as to how this problem has a roots in recent history as well. And then finally we are going to understand what should be India's policy towards this evolving situation in Myanmar. The relation or the bilateral relation of India with its neighbors are very important, and Myanmar being one of the very important neighbors, although not very significant and active player in India's foreign policy, but nonetheless is important. It's important mainly because of two reasons. First is that Myanmar, which in the map is located towards the eastern side of India's northeast, is the link to the ASEAN countries. ASEAN, which is the future of the global economy. We want to connect to ASEAN, and for that, for the land connectivity, Myanmar is the only option for us. We know that Myanmar itself is a member of ASEAN. It's an ASEAN nation. It's also a member of BIMSTEC. And so you can say that Myanmar is the common link between the South Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries. The second important reason why Myanmar is so significant is because of our northeast. We know that through land borders, we connect to the northeast via Chicken's Neck. It's not only very narrow, but it is also very vulnerable because of the Chinese threats. And so we always want to create multiple ways to reach to our northeast. And one of the ways is, of course, Bangladesh, and another way is through Myanmar. Reaching Myanmar through Bay of Bengal and then taking the land or the river route into our northeast. Not only that, people settled along the borders of India and Myanmar share common cultural links. And so, if we can somehow connect both sides of the people through economy, it will lead to a multiplier effect in the northeast. So now, since we have clearly established the significance of Myanmar in India's overall scheme of things, let us now quickly go over to the historical perspective so that you are in a better position to appreciate what has happened day before yesterday. So since 1990s, Myanmar was in the military control. But in 2008, Constitution obviously was drafted by military, people who were actually controlling the political affairs of the country. And so in the Constitution, they inserted a lot of conditions, and the conditions were such so as to make it impossible for Miss Aung San Suu Kyi to become president. Because the first condition was that to become a president of Myanmar, you must have military experience. That is the first condition. Then the second condition was that the family members of the president, including the president, must be Myanmarese citizens. Now we know that Miss Suu Kyi's sons have British nationality. So on both these counts, she was debarred to become president. Apart from that, there were three conditions put in the constitution itself which would ensure the perpetual control of military junta over internal and external affairs of the Myanmar. For example, in the constitution of Myanmar, it is written that the Ministry of Defense and Interior Ministry, which is like Home Ministry, will be controlled by military, and 25% of the total seats in parliament shall be reserved for military people. So military retained the control of internal affairs as well as the borders, and it also through this amendment ensured that whatever political decisions are taken inside the parliament, military will have a say on that. And so the first elections were conducted in 2010 under the changed constitution. And so the party which is most liked by the people, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, which is National League for Democracy, was not recognized, and so it boycotted the elections. Then in 2015, due to increasing international criticism and domestic pressure, most of the political prisoners belonging to National League for Democracy, including Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi herself, were released. Elections were conducted and her party came up with thumping majority. Then in 2020, next elections were conducted where her party secured 396 seats, enough to give her clear majority. But since the results of these elections have been declared, the army is not at peace. According to army, there were terrible frauds in the voter list in parliamentary elections held in November 2020, and the election commission failed to settle the matter. Claiming that this development would seriously impinge the path to democracy, the army declared an emergency, transferring all the powers to Commander-in-Chief himself. And finally, day before yesterday, all the power has been grasped by the military junta. Now in this respect, the comments from India have been very measured. India has expressed deep concern over the reports of an unfolding military coup in Myanmar and has also stressed that rule of law and the democratic process must be upheld. But unlike in the past, because the last time when the coup happened in late 1980s, India's response was very fierce. But that has changed, and that has changed keeping in mind India's national interest. Because India has adopted a particular policy towards Myanmar. And let us now discuss that. And so India's policy towards Myanmar is first and foremost characterized by non-interference in Myanmar's internal matters. Myanmar has been making news since last 20 to 30 years because of the dictatorship of the army there. Although India has supported democratization of Myanmar since 1990s, but India always wants that change to come from inside, driven from within the country. Now this has allowed Delhi to engage with the military of Myanmar as well as whichever party backed by the military is in power there. The second important aspect of India's policy towards Myanmar is that India wants engagement to supersede the criticism. India, of course, realizes the problems which Myanmar has created. For example, for India as well, the Rohingya crisis, which has led to the deluge of refugees inside India as well as in Bangladesh. But instead of criticism, India relies more on engagement with Myanmar to somehow resolve this problem so that the repatriation of these Rohingya refugees can be carried on. But other countries have resorted to criticism, but India has chosen engagement. Now we are aware of the increasing influence of China in the Indian subcontinent, and of course Myanmar is no exception, and not many countries have set up their embassies and offices in Myanmar, but China was the first one. And so Myanmar's growing closeness with China and the recent proposal of China-Myanmar economic corridor is a cause of concern for India. And so India wants to counter the increasing Chinese influence in Myanmar through increasing engagement. And so one of the pillars of or the motivations behind India's policy towards Myanmar is to counter the increasing Chinese influence. Of course, there are some problems with respect to the implementations of the projects on ground on which we are outpaced by China always, but India has tried to manage that. Then India has based its engagement with Myanmar on strategic infrastructural development, be it the proposal to build a petroleum refinery in Myanmar that would involve an investment of around $6 billion, or the commitment to operationalize crucial Sitwe port in Myanmar's Rakhine state, or be it India Myanmar Thailand trilateral highway as well as Kaladan multimodal transport project. So all these are India's commitment towards infrastructural development in Myanmar. Of course, some of them are for the India's own benefit. For example, the Kaladan multimodal project, which will be a connectivity project which will involve, of course, Sitwe port development and then utilization of Kaladan river going up to Paletwa and then finally taking the highway to the Mizoram border. So that way we are trying to reach Mizoram by taking help of Myanmar, and of course Myanmar is supporting us in that. And then the issue of border management confronts both these nations. There are insurgent movements going on which are troublemakers for both India as well as Myanmar, and hence there is a lot of scope in border security and development cooperation. And that is why India's response has been particularly measured when it comes to military coup in Myanmar, because we need the continued support of Myanmar not only to solve our internal issues challenges but also to counter the increasing impact and influence of China in South Asian region. IIP edged up 0.08% in April from same month in 2019. So the National Statistical Office has recently released the estimates of Index of Industrial Production or IIP for the month of April 2021. According to NSO, the IIP for the month of April stands at 126. Last year in April 2020, most of the industry had closed down their operations due to lockdown. Hence, it would not be correct to compare IIP in April 2021 with an IIP in April 2020. In comparison to April 2019, the IIP in April 2021 has registered growth of around 0.08%, which is like at the same level of 2 years earlier. And so in this regard, we are going to have this discussion about basics of index of industrial production, which shall be extremely relevant for the prelims examination. And so what is actually IIP? IIP is something which measures the quantum of changes in industrial production in an economy. The current base year for the IIP series in India is 2011 and 2012. Let us know in the comment section whether you clearly understand the concept of base year or not, so that we exactly know what we have to deliver on. If you don't understand what base year is, we will explain it in upcoming videos. And so it is compiled and published every month by National Statistical Office under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. This is also important to remember because UPSC has asked in the past questions with respect to ministries as well. And there are two ways in which IIP is categorized. One is sectoral classification and the second one is use-based classification. Now if you're getting confused, you can understand it by the way that industries are numerous. And so, a particular factory could be manufacturing an air conditioner. So, under the sectoral classification, it will be a manufacturing plant. But under the use-based classification, this particular industry would be categorized under consumer durables, right? And so, when we have two particular classifications, let us understand what they are. So, industrial production for the purpose of IIP is divided into three sectors: mining, manufacturing and electricity, or you can simply remember it as MEM or MEM. Out of all these three sectors, the highest weightage is given to the manufacturing sector, and this is also very important. Then what about use-based classification? And so it is then classified into 6 important categories. Primary goods, where goods directly obtained from natural sources and used for the further processing and consumption are categorized. For example, ores, minerals and electricity. Then we have category of capital goods, which mainly help in the production or the further manufacturing, for example plants, machinery, and goods used for further investments, for example boilers, air gas compressors, engines. So mainly those products which don't get consumed during the process itself. Then you have infrastructure and construction goods, which basically are finished goods which are primarily used in infrastructure industry or construction industry, for example paint, cement, cables and bricks. Then we have intermediate goods, which is like any good or product produced as an incomplete product or which goes as an input in production for further finishing, for example cotton yarn, which is then finally converted into textile, or plywood, which goes into the construction of various doors Then you have consumer durables. We have already talked about how air conditioner is consumer durable, which are products directly used by consumers and which have long durability. And then you have consumer non-durables like soybean oil, full cream, toned skim milk, which are directly used by consumers but cannot be preserved for long periods. And so, highest weightage is of primary products and lowest weightage is of capital goods. From the perspective of prelims examination, this particular discussion will be highly relevant. And so, let us now move on to the next news. Pak passes bill to let Jadhav appeal appears on page number 8. So, yesterday, Pakistan's National Assembly has passed a bill to provide the right of appeal to death row prisoner Kulbhushan Jadhav amidst a ruckus and boycott by the opposition. And this bill has been mainly passed to abide by the orders issued by International Court of Justice verdict. India had approached the ICJ against Pakistan for the denial of consular access to Jadhav and challenging the death sentence handed out to him. The Hague-based ICJ had ruled in July 2019 that Pakistan must undertake an effective review and reconsideration of the conviction and sentence of Jadhav and also to grant consular access to India without further delay. And so in this regard, it is time for us to reflect upon some of the basics of ICJ, not just for prelims examination but also under mains examination. And so what is ICJ? It is a principal judicial organ of United Nations. It was established in June 1945 by the Charter of UN. If we talk about its composition, it's very interesting. It consists of 15 judges who are elected for a 9-year terms by United Nations General Assembly and approved by Security Council. Election to ICJ is held concurrently in UNGA and UNSC and requires the absolute majority of the total membership in each organ. 1/3 of the court is elected every 3 years and judges are eligible for re-election. The elected judges sitting in ICJ are not representatives of the countries of their origin. They are expected to act impartially. So they are not like member of parliament representing their constituencies or countries in this particular case. And so 15 judges of the court are distributed in the following manner across the globe. 3 from Africa, 2 from Latin America and Caribbean, 3 from Asia, 5 from Western Europe and other states and 2 from Eastern Europe. This has been done so that judges or people from all across the world have representation in International Court of Justice. And so this brings us to the question, what are the role and jurisdiction of ICJ? And so it is clear in the constitution of the court that it may entertain 2 types of cases. One is legal dispute arising out of any treaty signed by both the states. It can entertain such legal disputes between states submitted to it by them. Then it can also take up requests for advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by United Nations organs and specialized agencies. Does this sound familiar to a mechanism which has been created in India in terms of the relationship of President with that of Supreme Court? Let us know in the comment section if you know that article or not. Does that mean almost everything gets covered under ICJ if the 2 states have treaties among them? No. State can exclude certain categories of dispute from the jurisdiction of ICJ through a declaration made by it and submitted to UN Secretary General. Accordingly, India exempted following disputes from ICJ jurisdiction. If the parties to the dispute have agreed or shall agree to have recourse to some other method or methods of settlements, then it would be out of the purview of ICJ. Dispute with the government of any state which is or has been member of the Commonwealth of Nations. Disputes in regard to matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of Republic of India shall be out of purview of ICJ. Disputes relating to armed conflicts, actions taken in self-defense, resistance to aggression, fulfillment of obligations imposed by the international bodies, and measures taken for protection of national security and ensuring national defense, all of this cannot be called into question by ICJ. So India has taken great measure to ensure its sovereignty is not touched upon. And this was very, very important. And so what about the judgments issued by ICJ? The judgment is final and binding on parties and there is no appeal mechanism, and that is why Pakistan had to create this particular bill to comply with the orders of ICJ. What about the implementation? The court itself has no direct power to ensure implementation of its judgments, and member states can approach United Nations Security Council for matters relating to the non-compliance of ICJ rulings. And so, there must be some limitations of ICJ. Of course, there are. Because it has no jurisdiction over individuals, corporations, and self-determination groups. And so it has no jurisdiction to try individual accused of war crimes, which is dealt by another quite similar organization, International Criminal Court. Let us know in the comment section how ICJ is different from ICC. Then ICJ only has jurisdiction based on consent, not compulsory jurisdiction. States can exempt the jurisdiction of ICJ over categories just like India has done it. And since there is no appellate mechanism, there is always a room for error which cannot be corrected, and there is no implementation power itself with ICJ. Of course, it can be enforced through UNSC. And so in this particular case, ICJ has directed Pakistan to review the conviction order of Kulbhushan Jadhav, and India should be granted consular access to him as per Article 36 of Vienna Convention of Consular Relation 1963.